Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Rising Tide, the impact of climate change on human health. I'm Chuck Sanders. I'm the Associate Dean for Research in Basic Sciences, and this is sort of the holiday edition of the webinar. So happy holidays to everyone. I hope that you've got a great set of plans ahead in the next couple of weeks. And this webinar series is hosted by the School of Medicine, Basic Sciences, again, as part of what's called the Lab to Table Conversations. And today we have a distinguished panel to discuss how climate changes impact human health. And as we all know, the climate is changing, and that the impact of climate change is being felt throughout the world in a variety of ways. So we have increases in pollution, average temperature, diminishing water quality, droughts, extreme weather, and a number of other things that we're already now familiar with hearing about on a daily basis. And some of these climate-based changes are complex and they impact human health, leading to things such as contributing to disorders such as asthma, allergies, cardiovascular problems, and other things. So today what we want to do is we want to talk about this. How does climate change affect human health? What are the mechanisms? How are animals and ecosystems similarly influenced? And how are these different impacts interconnected? What can we do in our individual lives to address these issues? And how is biomedical research working to remediate the impact of climate change? And so we're really looking forward to hearing from our distinguished panel of experts today. And so I'm very pleased now to turn it over to the panelists, and we'd like them to introduce themselves. And let's start with Eva Parker, who intriguingly is in Paris at the moment.
Yes, thank you so much. So hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Eva Parker. I'm a dermatologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I have a background in environmental science. It's what I studied as an undergraduate. And so this is my main academic interest, the intersection of climate change and health. In addition, I'm core faculty in the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society, and I'm an associate editor for the Journal of Climate Change and Health. I am the co-chair for the American Academy of Dermatology's Expert Resource Group on Climate Change and Environmental Affairs, and I sit on the International Society of Dermatology's Climate Change Committee. Thanks so much for having me tonight.
Thanks, Eva. And next, Louise Rollins-Smith.
Yes, I'm a professor of pathology, microbiology, and immunology, and also a professor of biological sciences. I have a Ph.D. in zoology, and then I studied microbiology and immunology as a postdoc, and ever since, my area of research is the immune defenses of amphibian species. So when I think about climate change, I'm thinking about impacts on entire ecosystems. So the animals, the plants, the entire setting. So the changes that are impacting animals, we don't always see the connections, but I would argue that human health is directly linked to ecosystem health. And we'll hear a lot more about that as we go.
Thank you, Louise. And finally, Manny Ascano.
Hello, everyone. My name is Manny Ascano. I'm an associate professor of biochemistry here at Vanderbilt University, and also a professor in pathology, microbiology, immunology. My training is in biochemistry of post-transcriptional gene regulation, which is gene regulation at the RNA level. You may have heard of RNA, as we all know, for SARS-CoV-2. My main interest in my lab is that we're interested in understanding RNA host pathogen interaction. So that what that means is we're interested in sort of the molecular interplay between what happens in humans and invading pathogens like bacteria or viruses. And of course, bacteria and viruses come from different places and different sources, and climate change does affect that. And obviously we'll get into that into this panel discussion. So happy holidays, everyone. And thank you for having me here in this panel.
Thanks again to our panelists for participating. Okay, so I'd like to start with a first question. I'd like to direct this one to Eva. In our environment, what are some of the major segments of the physical environment that climate change impacts that impact our health
Thank you. Yeah, this is a great foundational question because I think it's really important to have a broad overview of climate change, environmental degradation, and its overarching impacts. So first and foremost, because the global combustion of fossil fuels for human use has dramatically increased since the 1950s, unprecedented amounts of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have been released into the atmosphere, having a dramatic warming effect on our planet. Consequently, we've experienced the hottest years ever on record in the last decade. And as the planet warms, polar ice melts and sea levels rise. Storms also become supercharged by these higher temperatures, and we see an increase in the frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme weather events. Consequently, flooding is now a major risk, not only in the US, but in many regions globally, as we saw in Pakistan this summer. Conversely, though, areas that are historically arid are increasingly impacted by drought, which affects water and food security and increases the risk of wildfires, as we've seen places like California in the last few years. Additionally, global warming has effectively lengthened the growing season, with far more frost-free days now documented each year. And this leads to range expansion of insect vectors such as ticks, sandflies, and mosquitoes, which transmit parasitic and viral diseases to humans. And it also supercharges the antigenicity of pollen-producing plants like ragweed. In addition, climate change, industrialization, and urbanization have combined. And so we see that, that contributions to air pollution and water pollution from this trio of human-induced changes. In addition, stratospheric ozone depletion, deforestation, and ecosystem instability have all resulted. And this further threatens not only our food, but also our water supply.
Great, thank you. So, and let me just ask a follow-up question, Eva. So, obviously, you have all these things happening around you and in your life. Ultimately, it's our organs that get impacted by these changes. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And I think this would be a great time to show the slide from the CDC. I think it's a lovely diagram illustrating this. And what's important to understand is that basically every single organ system in our bodies is impacted negatively by climate change, and often in very complex and multifactorial ways. For example, extreme heat not only increases the risk of fatal heat stroke, but chronic exposure to high heat strains the heart, the lungs, and the kidneys, leading to organ dysfunction. Long-term exposure to heat and air pollution are linked with cardiovascular disease, including heart attack and stroke, chronic lung disease such as asthma, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And also diabetes is increased, and importantly, neuropsychiatric diseases like Parkinson's, dementia, altered cognition in children, and mental health disease are observed as a result of both extreme heat and air pollution. Climate change also increases things like seasonal allergies and has many effects on autoinflammatory diseases. Importantly, many populations are vulnerable, and I think that's important to understand that children, pregnant women, and the elderly are particularly vulnerable to the health effects of climate change. Additionally, many medications that we prescribe can further exacerbate our tendency to have heat-related illness.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. So, I'd like to ask Benny a question related to his work that comes out of Eva's comments here. So she mentioned the fact that climate change increases the distribution of disease vectors, microbes, and other things that can increase disease throughout the population, infectious disease throughout the population. And so some of these are called zoonotic diseases. How do zoonotic diseases play out in the context of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So zoonotic diseases are a group of infectious diseases that are spread between animals and humans and people. So, we know of several, things like chikungunya, which is a type of virus, are spread between mosquitoes and people. And when we think about, as Eva was saying, when we think about climate change, because climate change impacts every organism, the range of where mosquitoes, for example, live will expand. So typically mosquitoes that would carry things like dengue virus, chikungunya, were typically tropical and subtropical. As a function of a heating Earth, their range has expanded now to regions of the United States, southern United States. And so now we're seeing these sort of more tropical oriented diseases, which were more isolated, that are now actually spreading into different areas of the planet, including the United States and of course other countries as well.
Yeah, so here in Middle Tennessee, when I moved in 20 years ago, there were no armadillos. And now it's not at all uncommon to see armadillos out when you're hiking, or perhaps gone to the next horizon for armadillos by the road. Aren't they actually a disease vector for like plague? It seems like I've read that somewhere.
Leprosy.
Oh, leprosy. Okay,
yeah, Mycobacterium leprae.
Yeah. So there you go. Watch out for those armadillos. So, okay.
Prairie dogs do carry plague, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So here's a question for maybe for both Louise and Manny. That has to do with our experience with COVID. So is there a climate change angle on the introduction of COVID into the human population and how the pandemic has played out?
You want to take that, Louise, real quick?
Sure, I'll just jump in, and I'll be cautious because I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think the best evidence is that the virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, is most closely related to viruses found in bats. So I think the likelihood is that a bat virus was transmitted to either domestic animals or wild animals, and then humans came into contact with those animals, and it was adapted into humans and became a pandemic. So there's no real direct evidence that climate change impacted that, but if climate change moved people or the animals in closer proximity to each other, then it could have resulted in transmission that eventually reached humans. So you might be able to add to that, is sort of, that's kind of the consensus right now. I don't think we really know the whole story.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add to that, when you think about globalization and urbanization, there's really two populations, if you will, that are at effect. It's sort of a spreading of human population in areas that otherwise were not there before. And of course, in a loss of habitat, or sort of an overlap of habitat with other animals that were there before humans got there. And so there's a natural situation where those two are now going to meet as populations. And if there were any indigenous diseases, infections that are within a given animal population, they now have opportunities to spread into a different animal like humans. And then of course, as a function of that, as we urbanize different areas of the planet, we're typically 1-2 hours away from your a major airport, if you will. And that obviously is another vector that can be a factor of how fast and something can spread, an infectious disease can spread. So those two factors, while they have different aspects of directly contributing to climate change, meaning globalization and urbanization, they also have sort of this indirect approach, which is how, again, zoonotic diseases can start to move into areas that otherwise were not there historically.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I want to go back to another question for Louise, actually. And so I know that the focus of your research is not always just humans, but it's critters. And so how are animals impacted by climate change, including ecosystem loss? And how does that impact humans?
So animals are impacted in so many ways. I could mention quite a few, but I'll stick to just a few examples. And we don't always see the direct connection with human health, but there are a few examples. With amphibians, for example, amphibians are in the middle of lots of ecosystems. The adults consume insects, which probably help with limiting pests in agriculture. The tadpoles live in these watery environments, and they are consuming plant matter and detritus, breakdown products of plants, and those are also the food for mosquito larvae. So in some places, tadpoles are competing with mosquito larvae to possibly play a role in limiting mosquitoes. The other example that I would cite is Lyme disease, and Eva may be able to add to this. Lyme disease is caused by bacteria, but the bacteria are transmitted by ticks, and they need intermediate hosts, the white-footed mouse, the white-tailed deer. So we have the black-legged tick, the white-footed mouse, and the white-tailed deer, all required for transmission. And as the climate is warming, whereas Lyme disease is now present in the Northeast, upper Midwest, sometimes in California, now it has the potential to move northward into Canada. And I recently heard a presentation in which the ticks that carry Lyme disease have never been found in as far north as Alaska. So Alaska has its own non-native ticks, or its own native ticks that don't carry the disease, but now they're finding the non-native ticks that have the potential to bring Lyme disease to Alaska. So Lyme disease can move. So those are a couple of examples how animals are impacted, and indirectly humans will be impacted.
Yeah, thanks. So now if you go to Alaska, if the mosquitoes and black flies don't get you, the ticks will get you, thanks to climate change. All right, thanks. I like to return to the organ systems theme and ask Eva a question. So obviously one of the most exposed parts of our body to the environment is our skin. So how does climate change impact skin-based disorders?
That's a great question. And I think you hit the nail on the head that not only is the skin a very large and complex organ, but it is our primary interface with our environment. Consequently, many cutaneous diseases are climate sensitive. In particular, we see autoimmune and inflammatory diseases of the skin, such as atopic dermatitis, eczema, psoriasis, acne, and blistering diseases like pemphigus, all worsened by air pollution, wildfire smoke, and extreme weather events. Heat and flooding events both contribute to skin infections caused by many things, including bacteria, fungus, and viruses. Additionally, we see the effects of climate change, such as heat acting synergistically with ozone degradation and air pollution in contributing to rising rates of skin cancer, as well as increased signs of aging on the skin, including wrinkles and brown spots that we call lentigines. And while I could go on, that's just at least a small snapshot of the breadth of how climate change can affect one's skin.
Yeah, so I have a question about this. So you think of your core body temperature is usually going to be 98.6, even if it's really hot outside. But there must be a gradient at your skin, right? That it's actually much hotter than if it's a really hot day, hotter than your body temperature. How hot does your skin actually get?
So it doesn't necessarily get that hot per se, but I think you're hinting at the fact that the skin plays a major role in thermoregulation. And so we have receptors in our skin that sense heat, which communicate then with central core receptors that interpret core body temperature. And then those ultimately communicate with the hypothalamus in our brain, which is our major thermostat for our body. And when the ambient temperature begins to rise, that's the temperature around us in the air, and our bodies begin to heat up, the hypothalamus will trigger a complex cascade of signals that causes increased production of sweat on the skin, and that sweat evaporates and helps cool us. In addition, the hypothalamus in our brain also triggers complex mechanisms that cause vasodilation of the vessels in our skin. So blood begins to rush into our skin, releasing heat that way. And in fact, during heat stress, up to 60% of our cardiac output is shunted to the skin. And so that only leaves 40% to perfuse the rest of our body, including vital organs like the heart and brain. And that's why heat stroke can be so deadly, because of that lack of oxygenation to vital organs. It's important to understand that it's not just heat that factors into this, it's heat and humidity. And that's known as wet bulb temperature. And so those two combined are much more dangerous than heat alone. So if the heat is high, the temperature is high, and the humidity is high, your body's ability to regulate temperature decreases, because if it's super humid outside, your sweat won't evaporate.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. So in a way, if you have a heat stroke, you're suffocating because the oxygen's not getting to the right parts of your body.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. So, another question related to and this I think be for any of you is climate change impacting the world inequitably, so that certain populations are much more vulnerable to the ravages of climate change induced problems in human health than others?
I can jump in and say resoundingly no. There's immense inequity in how climate change is not only being caused, but also whom it is affecting. And I think if you just look within the United States, we see things like historical housing policies such as redlining with a detrimental legacy now, 90 years later, whereby those neighborhoods that were redlined and remain now of lower socioeconomic status and minoritized are actually urban heat islands and many degrees warmer than other areas of cities that have more green space and less concrete. We also know that those same redlined neighborhoods tend to have industrial sites and highways sited near them. So for example, in my hometown of Nashville, Tennessee, we have a redlined neighborhood where one of the major interstates goes by, and we have a low-income housing community near that highway, and 100,000 cars per day pass this housing community. So big surprise that this community has the highest rates of asthma in Nashville. I think globally it's very similar, and what we've seen is this divide between what we call the global north and the global south, where lower and middle income countries are disproportionately impacted by climate change, and the health of their population is disproportionately impacted. And not only are they contributing the absolute least to the problem, but they are overwhelmingly impacted by it and have the fewest resources for adaptation and the least capability for resiliency.
Thank you.
Right. And I would add, I mean, we're already seeing migrations of peoples whose lives have been disrupted by drought and famine. So that's, clearly they're disproportionately affected, and we're all experiencing that now.
And that's a great point, Louise. And with migration comes altered patterns of disease, particularly infectious and vector-borne diseases. It's what Manny alluded to about airports being within close proximity. So, we saw that with COVID as an example of how an infectious disease can spread globally within a matter of weeks.
And just again, to add to that sort of theme, I mean, when you think of rising seawater, right, it's not particular to any given space, but obviously island nations are going to be most affected by that. And again, here we are with the discussion of like, are they at fault, if you will, for the rising sea level? I think collectively we all are, but of course they are at most risk because of where they live. And then of course, this starts the cycle of what they need to do, how they can actually, affect their change, or they'll have to move. And then it goes again about what happens to these moving populations of people and animals into different spaces, and how that affects our ability deal with that as a world, right? So I think absolutely it's inequitable in that different populations will see different risks for different reasons, both economic and just where they live specifically, like the geography of it all, right? So.
Thank you. So I'd like to invite all three of you maybe to talk a little bit about how you think that research has the potential to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change on human health. Do you think it will be potentially a big player, or how do you feel about this?
You want to
go first, Manny?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so as I said, my lab's interest is in looking at infectious pathogens, and based on that, when we think about climate change and how my lab can contribute to understanding how we can sort of address that, there are many emerging infectious pathogens that are coming up, and we don't necessarily know what the mechanisms of how they infect humans are. And because they're, at one point thought to be exotic, and at some point they may not be, we ought to start to understand them at a basic scientific level, so that we're better prepared to handle the next, outbreak, whatever that may be. And hopefully we're better experienced in how to maintain that and contain that, so that it's not a pandemic. And so the type of work I do at a molecular level is really sort of reacting to this new reality, which is, I think it's fairly inevitable that these infectious pathogens are going to be more and more, something that we have to deal with. And so my lab is interested in trying to understand those basic mechanisms and trying to figure out if there's ways that we could address that at an applied state, in the clinic eventually, right? So.
Louise, what do you think?
So my work sort of intersects with a lot of ecologists. And so the ecologists are trying to, in terms of amphibians, trying to understand what are the essential features that amphibians need to survive. And so I think both biologists and wildlife managers would agree that what is needed is sort of diverse, complex ecosystems where there's water that can protect the amphibians, connected to grasslands and forest. So we need to kind of protect these natural areas for ecosystem health, which then indirectly impacts human health. So we kind of need both. We need to protect the ecosystems, and we need to, and indirectly that helps to protect human health. So that's kind of where the research that I am aware of is kind of leading.
Great, thanks. Eva.
I think it's a hard question to answer, because the problem of climate change is really wickedly complex and broad, and really is sort of the health crisis of this century. I will say that I think any research is going to have to be broad and interdisciplinary. We, especially in medicine, in my opinion, can't operate in a silo and only look at risk factors for disease or treatments for disease. I do think that climate solutions are going to require broad cooperation and broad thinking, and incorporate our economists, our policymakers, our sociologists, our environmental scientists, our engineers, our ethicists, our physicians, our basic science researchers, our ecologists, our biologists. And I will say that regardless of what specialty you're in science, I think that anyone can make this a research priority, and that helps to contribute to solutions and move us closer to reining in greenhouse gas emissions and the negative impacts of climate change. I also think we have a lot of knowledge gaps within medicine still, and especially in lower and middle income countries. We just don't know how climate change is truly impacting those populations, and there's not good data with which to use for modeling and projections in those populations, which is a huge portion of the world. And so I think that much more needs to be done to generate data that we can use in our analyses to understand how climate change is impacting disease in different populations and in different geographic locations, and what the risk factors truly are.
Yeah, so I'm actually curious about funding for work that's at the interface between health and climate change. Usually, if you think about health funding in the United States, you know, the 100,000-pound gorilla is the National Institutes of Health. Do you find it difficult to justify this type of research to NIH, or are they generally quite receptive?
I think now there's increasing funding available. The NIH now has several grants available for different avenues of research within health and climate change. Burroughs Wellcome also has some funding, but those funding opportunities are relatively new. And I think they will increase. I think they will increase with time, especially with the attention that climate change is getting.
Yeah, okay. Are there other reliable funders? Obviously, for the actual process of climate change, you have people like National Science Foundation.
Right. I think we should keep in mind the National Science Foundation. So National Science Foundation has supported the fundamental host pathogen research that I do, and also the ecologists who are that I interact with. And so I think both NIH and National Science Foundation are contributing important ways.
Okay, great.
And I would add to that, you know, there are other foundations now that are recognizing climate change really intersects with many other things like health, of course. So that I'm aware of things like Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Gates Foundation, in many ways having different grant mechanisms that address this directly in climate change, but are also looking at this from a health perspective, from a pathogen perspective, and looking at ways to fund research that, you know, looks at how do we address the next major outbreak and things like this. So I think it is sort of like all hands on deck, and there's a general consensus that, you know, this is going to be something that we ought to look at a very multidisciplinary way. And, you know, I think it's a good place that we're sort of moving in that direction. It's not just at the NIH, not just NSF, but also other foundations as well.
Right. I'm going to take a look at some of the questions and answers that have been submitted here. And let me begin with a question from Denise Bahil. Can you share more about food? The nutrient density of our food based on farming practice is a huge health risk. There is a clear link between our farming practices and diseases such as obesity and type 2 diabetes.
I am not a food expert, but I will just comment, and I'm not an expert on farming techniques. I'm a physician, but I will comment just generically about climate change and nutrient density of foods. So I mentioned earlier when you asked that climate change is sort of supercharging the antigenicity of pollen producing plants. And that is true. It's not only the longer growing season that's allowing plants to grow longer and produce more pollen, but the CO2 concentrations in the air are actually making the pollen itself more antigenic. Interestingly, that is opposite for our food crops versus our sort of detrimental antigenic plants, excuse me. So for food crops, we see that higher CO2 concentrations actually lower the nutrient density, in particular key nutrients like things like protein, zinc, iron, B vitamins, etc. And so that's probably as far as I can speak to this topic. I don't know if anyone else has knowledge about farming practices per se, but I will say that just greenhouse gas concentrations being elevated lower the nutrient quality of our food.
Right. So I would add that agricultural practices that use herbicides are kind of creating deserts for butterflies and other insects that are important pollinators. We forget about the importance of bees and butterflies as pollinators in agriculture. And so these herbicide, it's great for the farmers to raise crops, but it's creating sort of deserts for the insects that are also important.
Yeah, I saw recently on the news that after the huge hurricane that hit Florida this year, that it wiped out large swaths of the bee population there, which is a huge problem then for agriculture there because they can't get things pollinated properly. Amazing. So
when you see things like drought contributing to conflict and to famine and to migration, so we're seeing that, you know, we saw that in Syria. So the Syrian civil war was really underpinned by a longstanding drought fueled by climate change and poor water management for crop irrigation that then led to crop failures and urban migration that then led to factional fighting, which ended up sort of causing the civil war in Syria. You know, we're seeing where conflict in Ukraine is impacting food supply in places like Somalia, and it is exacerbating the existing drought that's in Somalia and contributing to famine there. We see climate change impacting food supply and creating famine in Madagascar. So I think that's the other side of it, is not only are the crops less nutrient dense potentially because of CO2 concentrations, but you have things like extreme weather events and flooding destroying crops in places like our own country in Florida, but also in places like Pakistan from the flooding this summer. And then you have the other side of that coin where drought is also contributing to crop failure. And at the end of the day, it all leads to water and food insecurity.
yeah, wow. So here's a question from Richard Navarro. I am wondering if there are airborne toxins that impact the aggressiveness and volatility of humans. I suspect that air pollution resulting from climate change may be a contributing factor in the hostility being shown by humans.
Hostility.
Yeah, I wish some of our neurology colleagues were on, or our psychiatry colleagues who could comment. Actually, heat has been shown to increase aggression and violent behavior, and that's well documented that during heat waves, violent behavior increases. Certainly, there's been plenty of data showing neuropsychiatric effects from air pollution, including lower cognition, dementia, Parkinson's, and mental health disorders, but I'm not sure that there's any evidence linking specifically aggressive behavior or hostility with air pollution.
Yeah, thanks. So here is a question from, it's, hi, my name is Sofia Alfaro. I'm a rising senior at Puesa de Maria School in Managua, Nicaragua. I was wondering if Ms. Parker, Dr. Parker, could address, if possible, how climate change may make waterborne illnesses to start. Like, for example, is it just by touching the water constantly doing so, or are there more factors for this illness to start?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. Is it just waterborne illnesses in general, or did she ask about a specific one that I missed?
Yeah, no, waterborne illnesses in general.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have an international audience. So great question. I think there's multiple ways to look at this, and I think Manny and Louise may be able to talk a little bit about this as well. You know, as water temperatures rise, we can see increase in pathogens. So especially in salt water, we can see greater rates of Vibrio vulnificus infections, which can be not only foodborne, but if you have a wound on your skin, can infect the skin and can cause a severe, even life-threatening infection. And we're seeing Vibrio cases appearing earlier in the year, lasting longer in the year, and more northward than historically has been observed. We also know with things like flooding that many infections and waterborne illnesses can manifest. partly because of just the chronic exposure to water if you're wading through it trying to escape floodwaters, but also too because floodwaters are often contaminated with sewage, with industrial chemicals, with fertilizer and other agricultural runoff. And so we can see greater rates of diarrheal illness. Cholera is a great example of that. In addition to that, you can see many skin infections as a result. And again, it goes back to wounds on the skin and contaminated water and ease of inoculation. But it can be very unusual and very serious atypical pathogens, things like Aeromonas, as an example, that we don't typically see on a daily basis.
Great. So Ethan Riley writes, as natural disasters and conflicts caused by climate change become more frequent and severe, forced mass displacement is projected by the UN to increase significantly. What are the impacts of mass displacement events on the health of moving, remaining, and receiving populations?
Well, I mean, let me take a stab at that. There's a lot packed into that question. So thank you for that question. But, maybe I could think about this even a little bit more historically. When you think about Ellis Island, you think of immigration as sort of mass movement. Whenever you have human populations moving, you always run the risk of having whatever endemic diseases exist in one population intermixing now with the next, the incoming population. And so, it's always going to be of concern. And of course, as natural disasters continue, that level of mixing, if you will continue to sort of just lead to more unpredictable states, given the fact that these different populations were otherwise isolated from each other. And so it's certainly fair to say that, any mass migration, whether it be human and other humans or, animals moving from one area to another, are themselves factors that can lead to an increased risk, at least for infectious pathogens, certainly. So this is of concern and something that we should be looking at. And, I think the topic for today, we've sort of hit this on the head several times already about it. So.
May I add that, I think it's also disruption in existing care and services that can occur. And so, for instance, if you have an extreme weather event that leads to climate migration, say from a lower or middle income country where they may have mass drug administration programs and surveillance programs for a particular infectious disease, those can get disrupted. And as those members of the population migrate, infections can come with them. So for an example, I've been in London for the last 3 months doing some work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And while I was in the UK, there was an outbreak of diphtheria among a newly arrived migrant population because of disruption of normal vaccine administration. And this was an unvaccinated population. So that's just one example of how climate can displace populations, and then we alter patterns of infectious diseases or vector-borne diseases.
So maybe I'll ask a question that back on the topic of health disparities, inequities between populations. So, it's sort of a sad element of this conversation that we're all able to have this conversation about the mass displacements, which are always over there somewhere, right? They're not so much here in the United States so far. I'm curious if there has been any modeling done, or if you just have any personal projections. When does it all come home to roost here in the United States? When will we have our first mass event, a famine or something that just totally upends society? Do you have any ideas about this? Or will it just be death by 1,000 cuts here?
I think we've already had many of them. I think just perhaps it's not recognized as such because we're a high resource setting and a high income country. And so we're able to, I think, blunt in many ways the effects of those individual extreme weather events with the resources and response that we're able to raise as a result of those events. But I'm just thinking about back to last year at this time in December, when the terrible tornadoes ripped through parts of Tennessee and Kentucky, and entire towns were absolutely decimated, and we had mass casualty events. And there were, thousands of people who lost their home and had no place to go. And they were internally displaced. They had to largely find other places to live within the state of Kentucky, as an example. I think it's already been documented that there's been a fair amount of migration out of places like California due to the droughts and extreme heat and wildfires that have resulted in the last few years. So I think it's already happening. I think it's just under-recognized within the United States. And we've had plenty of events historically, like Katrina, where there are many people who left New Orleans post-Katrina who have never returned. I just think we forget about the magnitude of the displacement and the migration because it doesn't feel as unusual because people are moving within the United States.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I can add to that, something that Chucky said, where it feels like it's hitting home. And again, I want to echo what Eva said about, in terms of a high resource country like the United States. But I recently went to the grocery store, for example, a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed there were no eggs on the shelves. And then I went back maybe a week after, and I realized there were still no eggs on the shelf. So it got me curious, because why are there no eggs in the grocery store? And so I looked that up, and it turns out there's a national, in fact, international shortage on eggs. I dug a little deeper. It turns out that, in fact, there was several outbreaks in avian flu, and not just in the United States, but actually the UK I saw, and also in parts of in Europe, actually. So it turned out that avian flu hit several agricultural regions. They had to deal with that by having to sacrifice those animals. And of course, now we have this egg shortage, which seems rather mundane. But if you really think about what avian flu is, fundamentally, the migratory patterns of these birds are being affected by climate change, and they're moving in different places. And as a function of that, avian flu is actually changing in where it's being hit, where it's spreading that type of disease. So it's really hitting at many, many states. And then you may think, oh, it's just because I can't make pie tomorrow. But in fact, what's happening ultimately is that affects the food chain all the way down. And it's abstracted. You won't necessarily see that if you don't dig a little bit deeper. But yeah, I agree. I think we're certainly seeing the impact already, and it's just going to be a matter of whether we see and appreciate it for what it really is.
I also think we've all become sadly accustomed to supply chain disruptions as a result of COVID, but understand that climate change, in particular extreme weather events, are another factor that put pressure on supply chains, and I think will become increasingly an issue. And so it's not just necessarily getting microchips for our devices and our cars, but it's also medical supplies. And we've seen that, a few times in the recent past. In fact, several years ago, when hurricanes hit Puerto Rico, most of the manufacturing for lidocaine, a topical anesthetic that's also injected by the dentist and the dermatologist and many other medical professionals for minor procedures, was in severe short supply because the factories and facilities that manufactured it in Puerto Rico were destroyed or had no power because of the disruption to the power grids there. Recently, too, we saw disruptions in supplies for CT imaging equipment. And I think that's going to be a continued problem that we see in medicine and will likely continue to disrupt our ability to deliver timely care as climate change gets worse.
Thank you. We got just a few more questions here. Maybe we can fit them in before we wrap up. This is a question from Jacob Beckstead. As a follow-up to the question regarding displaced populations and communicable diseases, what are possible preventive actions we can take to reduce strain on our post-pandemic medical system as people are forced to move into population centers?
I mean, that's really tough because many communicable diseases are more easily transmitted when you have a high population density confined within a small area. So we see that commonly in shelters and internationally in migrant camps and refugee camps. And it's many common things like scabies and head lice and body louse and respiratory infections, diarrheal illnesses, but even highly infectious diseases like measles and diphtheria can rapidly spread. Of course, many things have vaccinations, and so ensuring that vaccination supply is available and equitably distributed is one manner. And I always think, well, what's the root of the problem? And if it's climate change that's causing migration, then the more we can do as a global society to mitigate climate impacts, then the less migration we have and the less disruption in patterns of disease we'll see.
And the last two questions are actually wonderful wrap-up questions. The first is from Sophia Hunter. This subject is a great example of how interdisciplinary collaboration is vital to our progression of addressing issues such as is in the case of climate change and public health. In your work, how do you approach working with others of different subjects, preparing for those conversations, and being open to the learning experience you will hopefully share with others?
I can just jump in and say that science is really collaborative, and we have all the means, including Zoom and email and international conferences that bring us all together. And so that's how we make progress. We look at a problem and collaborate with many to try to solve those problems.
Yeah, it seems like all the good problems these days require collaboration to make progress. And so that's a good thing. And maybe one final question here. And this is from David Vago. You all have emphasized how the future health of the planet and this is right. The future health of the planet and human health are inextricably linked. Are any of you involved in or aware of curriculum development resources for climate change impact on human health and solution-driven technology that can be incorporated into such curricula to address the harmful impact across domains of health, mental, physical, social, etc.?
So this is a topic that's been, I think, increasingly emphasized nationally and globally. In fact, many medical schools have yet to incorporate a climate curriculum into their education of our future generation of nurses, doctors, and allied health professionals. So this is an area of, I think, great interest, at least personally for me. The AMA and many other medical societies have long had a call for action on this. So depending on what specialty you're in, you can always check with your local medical society or your national or international medical society to see if they have curriculum. I will do a promotion for, sorry, it's not Vanderbilt, but Columbia School of Public Health, the Mailman School of Public Health. They have the Global Consortium for Health Education, and they have recently developed a number of resources, which include problem-based learning, as well as slide decks that can be incorporated into curriculum of a given topic. And I led 2 modules on dermatology and climate-related health effects, but it spans the gamut of human health, from cardiovascular disease to lung disease to allergies, infections, kidney disease, et cetera. So there's broad resources there. And then I think those would probably be the 2 best places: specific medical societies and then the global consortium.
Great, thank you. Any final thoughts as we wrap up here? Well, we really, really appreciate our panelists taking the time to join us today, especially coming from Paris. That's rather heroic. And thank you to all those who tuned into this webinar. We appreciate it that you're interested in this very, very important topic. And Godspeed to all the scientists who are pursuing this. and to all those trying to make the world a better place. So I'd like to wish everybody happy holidays, and we'll see you next month at the next webinar, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.